LinkedIn page. Come on. Do you even know what's on here? This will be great for everyone in the room then. So we're not sure when this was written, but writer and entrepreneur Damon Brown believes in warm, fuzzy technology and in computers bringing us closer together if we choose to let them. He's recently acquired Apple Top 10 app, Cuddler. When was that?
The app was acquired about 2 months ago.
2 months ago, okay. Congratulations, awesome.
Thank you.
Landed on the cover of the Wall Street Journal and kickstarted the platonic connection industry. His breakthrough TED book, Our Virtual Shadow, Why We Are Obsessed with Documenting Our Lives Online, foreshadowed the modern analog living movement, and his TED Talks push the value of being fully present in our daily lives. Just as soon as I check my phone, I will continue. Both Cuddler and his previous app, So Quotable, reflect his understanding of both tech and humanity, and that's, I think, a good way to segue into Damon Brown. Round of applause for Damon.
How are you guys doing? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm a low talker, so I want to make sure you can hear me. How are you enjoying the talk so far? How many of you are thinking about freelancing now? Wow, that's an improvement, I think, by 50%. So I'm going to confess a habit I've had for about 15 years. I make my own business cards. How many of you guys make your own business cards? Here's one of mine, one of my favorites. I became a speaker, and obviously I need a bow. This one's a little bit closer. I sold this app called Cuddler, which is about people physically connecting, and it's like a warm, fuzzy card. Now the habit actually started about 15 years ago, when I first started freelancing, and I was broke. So this is before Vistaprint, before Move cards and things like that. So you didn't really have an option back in the early 2000s. So I'd go to Staples, Office Max, whatever was around back in Chicago, which is where I started my career. And I'd go get the Avery papers. Have you guys heard of Avery? You know what I'm talking about? They used to be brown. I think they still sell them. They used to be brown, and they'd come in they'd be like envelopes and other things, but they'd be pre-formatted cards that you can stick into your very cheap printer at home and hope that they work out fine. So I had the pre-perforated business cards, the ones with the sticky edges on them that you had to kind of rub out so nobody knew that you made them yourself. So I take them home, spend my $4 and change, take it home, put them on my cheap printer, and hope that everything printed out okay, because I couldn't afford more ink. And it was a sense of pride spending that afternoon, maybe even that day, documenting what I was doing. I started writing for Playboy, so suddenly Playboy popped up on there. Credibility. I got a proper email address, like with my own domain. That ended up being a sense of pride. So I kept that habit up, and I've been doing my own business cards, again, for 15 years. I redo them every 2 years. I've come out with apps, like the ones that Matt mentioned. I've come out with books. I've written 12 books at this point. I've written for lots of outlets, like some of you have too. And outlets come and go. And so my business card had to reflect who I was. Old school, particularly for a guy that focuses on intimacy and technology. So I'm working on my business card about 2 years ago. Last time I was working on it. Actually, it is this one. So I'm working on it. I just did my first TED Talk, so I'm like geeked about that. I'm working on an app, which I've never done before because I'm a journalist. Right? And I'm working on that. I put it on there too. I'm like, this is great. I have a kid, a baby at the time, and I take time away from my baby on a Saturday afternoon to spend all afternoon designing my card. I'm in Photoshop, I'm doing the fonts, I'm doing the colors, I'm getting all nerdy with it. This is a representation of who I am. And I'm about to send away the card to the printer, which I can actually afford now, a real printer. And I realized I made a mistake. The word journalist isn't on there. Let that sink in. So 15 years as a full-time freelancer, 25 years as a journalist, 2 degrees in journalism, master's in magazine publishing. and it's not on there. Spent hours working on it. It's not on there. The big part about it, which you can probably guess, is I was okay with it not being on there. That started a little bit of a crisis, as you can imagine. Journalist is part of my identity. So what did it mean? And I could say it was a mid-career crisis, but hopefully my career is longer than 30 years. But it got me on this journey of thinking, what does it mean to be a journalist? And I realized as I talked to my peers, and I'm on the board of ASGA, so as I talked to other folks, in hushed silence, of course, because I didn't want other people to know that it wasn't on my business card. Starting these conversations, I realized that my crisis was your crisis, and your crisis, and your crisis. And those crises represented where our media was today. So the thing is that none of us are journalists anymore. We're actually something bigger. I found out this is wonderful. We should be excited, despite the trepidation. And so my long, thoughtful process, or at least it felt thoughtful to me, of understanding what I was now, I came to 3 conclusions of what I represented. And perhaps they're what you represent too. The first one is that we are now storytellers. Think about that one. So some of you are like, that Damon, journalism is storytelling. No, actually it's not. It sometimes is. Some of the best journalism is storytelling, but sometimes it's not. I think the term was dictation journalism, which I couldn't wait to throw into this talk. So when I first started, it was back in Chicago. I was writing for a suburban magazine, or a suburban newspaper on the outskirts of Chicago. I think it was Skokie, Illinois. You guys have heard of that? And I was covering City Hall. And when I first started, even though I had some journalism experience under my belt, it was the idea of going to City Hall and getting the budget, the exciting budget, and saying, yeah, this is the number. This number went up. This number went down. This number is neutral. Is that journalism? Yeah, actually, it is. Is that storytelling? Not so much. If this number goes up, then perhaps a person on the street can get a sandwich. If this number goes down, then perhaps these people can't send their first generation to university. So the thing is that there's a sense of storytelling that needs to happen when we get this information. Now, of course, this was 15 years ago when I first started. The amount of data that we have, the amount of information we have access to, it's cheap. Anyone can get that budget right now. Pull out your smartphones if you have one. It'll take 0.4 seconds to get that same information. And so we're needed more than ever to actually connect those dots. One of the rubs that we have, though, is that we have more information than ever, as you guys understand, and I won't get into the road statistics. But we might have a 6-second video that's coming from a civil unrest in the Midwest. We might have a quote that's coming from a hearing that's happening on Capitol Hill. And the thing is that we actually mistake that for storytelling. We think we can watch a quick video and understand what's happening. We think we could read a 140-character tweet and get it. I think we should know better. Our audience does not. They think that we can capture this particular thing and understand exactly what's happening in Ferguson, or read a tweet and know exactly what's happening in an 11-hour hearing. That's not true. So our job, more so than ever, is to be the storytellers. We have to connect those dots. And there's more dots than ever to connect. So the idea of not needing journalists, I would argue it's the opposite. So number 1, being storytellers. Number 2, being documenters. And as was mentioned, I wrote a book about our virtual shadow, why we're obsessed with documenting our lives online. The twist is that we're kind of paid to document. Now, how many of you guys are on Facebook? Yeah, show of hands. And how many of you are on there daily? Great. And how many of you are on Twitter? And how many of you are on Twitter daily? How many of you have been on there since I started talking? This is what I mean. And I don't mean that in a negative or even a good way. That's just what it is right now. I joined Twitter in 2007 at the behest of a good friend that was in Silicon Valley. My first major book was going to come out about sexuality in video games, so a niche of a niche. We worked that one out. And I was trying to make sure I found the audience for it. And he was like, well, you're working with this independent publisher. You have no budget. He has no budget. You want to go to all these different cities and connect with your audiences. This will enable you to connect with your audiences without going to these different places. It is a low budget way of doing it. Simple as that. That's why I got on Twitter. I had no idea what the hell I was doing, even with my tech background. So I got on there, I messed around every day for several months. I'm thinking 6, 7 months. And one day I woke up, got on there, and I got it. And it's like all technology, I would argue. It doesn't make sense until it does, and once it does, you can't see your life without it. That was Twitter. And for me, each of you are different, but for me, it represented half a soapbox for me to share my ideas. Maybe what I had for breakfast. Forgive me, I like food. But what I had for breakfast, where I was traveling, what article caught my eye. And other times, it was a news feed. What's happening in the world today? What's going on? What I started to notice, though, is that was morphing me as a journalist. Sorry, South Jersey's coming out. As a journalist. And so, initially, and some of you who have freelance might know this routine, and some of you staff writers might know this routine too. I'd have an idea. I'd contact my editor. We'd go back and forth on the specifics because I'm a freelancer. So the contract, the details, all those things that we've talked about at previous panels. Very important stuff. Then I get the green light. Then I work on the story for 2 months, maybe 3 months. Then I'd send it to my editor. And my editor would get it back to me. And it'll be 2 weeks. And then finally it would be approved and it would get scheduled. 6 months later, I'm in Playboy. And so it's that phone call. Hey, yeah, you gotta pick up the latest issue of Playboy. You gotta pick it up. It's on newsstands right now. But you have to get it now because they say it's for the month of October, but it's really on the newsstands in September, and they're gonna take it off early. But it's gonna be only on there for really 2 weeks, because they take it off early sometimes. So, in fact, if you can't just get it now because you have to get the back issue, and they're gonna charge twice as much for the back issue, and you don't want to do that. You got to wait 6 weeks for the back issue, and it's just a scam. You know what? I'll just fax it to you. I'll just make a copy. I'll just scan it. I'll just get it to you. How many of you have done that phone call when something of yours has run? None? Okay, thank you. It's like, please don't date me. I've been doing this for like 20 years. I feel really old now. And so the idea that if I came up with the idea at this moment in November 2015, then people wouldn't read it or understand, or I couldn't even share it until April, maybe, of 2016. And that's with my contacts at Playboy. It can be a lot longer. As someone mentioned, there's an article in Sunset that still hasn't run yet. You know, people are like waiting a long time for these things to happen. A few things changed though. The biggest thing was the internet. So of course I can just say, you know, go to this link. It's not as romantic as actually sending the magazine to people. But also, there started to be a conversation that started to happen on Twitter. Twitter for me, it could be Google+, doesn't matter. It could be LinkedIn for you, doesn't matter. So I come up with an idea. I see an article that I love. I share it. That article being shared not only starts my process of sending a query related to that article, it also starts a process of me having a conversation with people about that particular topic. And suddenly, my audience, my couple or 3,000 or however many people that follow me on Twitter, suddenly they're part of that conversation. These people who decided to listen to me because I talk a lot about intimacy and technology. Suddenly my audience, my readership, is starting to inform how I'm doing my query. And if I'm lucky enough to get an article, are lucky enough to work on a book, then they're part of that process. And suddenly there are quotes, there are ideas, there are shifts that are happening within my book proposal, within the article once I get the assignment, to the point where when that article comes out, it ends up being a beautiful archive of a conversation that's happened over the course of 6 months. So in a sense, when the article comes out, it's not the beginning of a conversation. How ludicrous is that? It's actually the end of a conversation and the beginning of a new one. I've been talking with people all along. It's different. That's something that I did not experience 15 years ago when I started. One of the things that you'll find with social media, and I think you'll find it once you get more involved with it, is that you'll stop following the Washington Post. And no offense, the UTs. Suddenly, you're going to be looking for the voices behind it. Who are the people who are creating it? It's not really about the outlets anymore, because we are the outlets. Something to think about. So number one, being a storyteller. Number two, documenting what we find. And number three, I'm nervous about this one, being more of a participator. It sounds sacrilege, and some of the earlier panels touched on it, which made me feel a lot better because I wasn't the first guy running up the hill. But being participators, it sounds sacrilege. I'm pretty sure that my mentors, some of them who have passed away, are rolling in their graves right now. But the idea that journalism actually cannot be truly objective. If you think about it, when you write any story, you're deciding on the lead. You're deciding on who you interview and who you don't interview. You're deciding on what you cover. The things that you do are created through a filter. Now, we've always looked at the negative side of that filter. Bias this, Democrat this, Republican this, Indie that. But in reality, that filter could be your strength. Let me get a little bit deeper. For a very long time, and particularly within the newspaper industry, we said we're objective parties. We have no position on anything. Except on an occasional Sunday, or maybe every day if you're lucky. I have a column in inkmagazine.com, so that's an example of that. But we have these moments where suddenly we have an opinion. We have the op-ed section. We have this column. We really hate this mayor. He's full of BS. We really think crime is too high. This is what we should be doing in the schools. That's how we really feel about it. And then we disappear. Suddenly there's a disconnect between, between the traditional journalism that we're cranking out every day and then the op-eds that we're writing. Suddenly the Wizard of Oz is hid right behind the curtain. The big thing that happened with that, you're seeing a pattern, is social media. We can't hide behind the curtain anymore. If we're writing a story about the mayor, and then we're on Twitter talking about the mayor, it doesn't quite add up. Now, we talked about in a previous panel about how there should be a separation, and some people argue there should be a blend. But why not take advantage of that? Why not be smarter about that? It's really a shame that we do not give our perspective as much as we can, because again, there's more information and more data than ever. And everyone else is giving their opinion. But who better to talk about intimacy and technology and have a POV of it than me? Who better to talk about sustainability and ecosystems than Claire? Who better? So I think one of the things that's happened is that in our quest for objectivity, we've forgotten that we're actually experts. And that we can actually inform the conversation in a direct way. The facts don't really make much sense unless there's a story attached to them. We're the ones that should be creating that story. And part of it is getting involved through different media. So my final thought on this, as we become storytellers, as we become documenters, as we become participators, is that journalism is not dying. In fact, we're being called upon to lean on our more latent skills to pull the culture and the conversation forward. If anything, it's our responsibility to move this cultural conversation to the next level. And I hope you will join me in excitedly doing so. Thank you. I think we're open for questions, so I kind of want to hide in the corner now.
Oh, sure.
So to your last point, what are your thoughts on how we can integrate the journalistic research and reporting with the part of us that may be experts? So for instance, Claire in sustainability, you on intimacy and pet.
Yeah, I think one of the key things is to find a unity in whatever you're saying. So when people follow me on Twitter, I'm Brown Damon, if you want to follow me on Twitter. When people follow me on Twitter, then they know that the things that I research and the insights that I get are the very things that are informing the stories that they're going to read down the line. And also informing the talks that they hear. And also informing any books that I end up writing. And also informing any apps or any entrepreneurship that I am doing. So for me, my answer is to unify everything. So it's very much of what you see is what you get. That also means you have to walk the walk. And so if you say that you believe in a particular thing, or you're passionate about a particular thing, but your creations, your entrepreneurship, your decisions that you make as an editor, as a writer, as a speaker, do not reflect that, then you will be held accountable. And that's the other side to that. So I think there's a way of, at least for me, unifying all those different things and finding out my true core as a creator, as a storyteller, as a documenter, as a participator, and making sure that that's genuine across every single thing that I do. Yeah, Claire.
I just wonder I can see how that would work if you have a book and your book is, on a specific topic and like my friend Paul Greenberg wrote for fish and then he wrote
Sure.
American Catch, now he's kind of championing buying fish from America. And that makes sense to me, but I'm wondering, I do articles, I don't write books, and so if I have this big opinion on something, I might get pushback from editors. If there's like a slant or a opinion, are you selling that as an opinion, or you talk to your editor, and how do you make that clear?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I really think it depends on the publication. So if you have a publication or a section as straight narrowed essay, the New York Times news section, then that's going to be different than I used to write for the New York Post. If you guys know the New York Post, that's very different, right? And so I was covering Silicon Valley for the New York Post when I used to live in San Francisco. So that's when the iPhone came out, and it was really a rip-rolling time. And so I was freelancing for the Sunday business section, and the type of writing that I did for them, very different. And a lot of fun. And it was a really good, unique experience as far as tailoring my voice and giving a distinct POV, because that's what the New York Post does. So I think you also have to be wise as far as what outlets you represent. I wouldn't give the same story to Playboy as I would to Maxim, as I would to AARP, as I would to Family Circle. But most of those publications I've been involved in. So I think it's a matter of using that freelance wisdom as you gain it, or if you have it now, and saying, all right, well, how much of a POV do they want? And I think as journalists, we tend to say, they don't want any POV. I think that's becoming something that's hampering us. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sure.
In this quest to be, better storytellers and focus on that aspect of the job, what are some things, we can be doing to develop, that kind of skill set more?
As far as being better storytellers on the job, I think the first thing is getting into some type of routine. I think Randy and a few other people mentioned that Twitter and Facebook, in a sense, we're already talking all the time, right? So that is a sense of storytelling, a sense of narration, even if it's about what we had for breakfast this morning. But I think when it comes to our personal thing, it's about finding those ways to improve our voice and to become stronger. I started my ink column about 3 or 4 months ago, and I've done several columns in my lifetime. But there's something, I do it 3 times a week now, and there's something about that routine, that rigor, where it's like, I know my audience, I need to get to know my audience better, I need to talk about it, I need to be in this space where I'm serving them the most possible, as frequently as possible. So it's a matter of stepping up to that challenge and doing it in different formats that you might not be comfortable with. I haven't had a column in 3 years. And so suddenly getting back into the horse and saying, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you got 1,000 words due. What are you going to do with it? And so I guess I would put it down to discipline. And applying that discipline not to the traditional journalism fields as far as doing good leads and understanding headlines and things like that, but applying it to new mediums, applying discipline to Twitter, applying discipline to Facebook, applying discipline to these different things that you do, again, and finding that center. And you'll find that, at least for me, when I got more disciplined for understanding what I put out there on my social media, what I put out there on my business card, what I put out there in the articles that I wrote, then that gave me discipline across the board. And that's hopefully how I became a better storyteller. Yeah.
How do we make a balance these days with all the interaction that we get from Twitter, Facebook, and the stories that we need to write, or we want to write? I mean, right now, most of the stories that are written in media outlets are very cheesy or things that people will click on, but not necessarily have any context or any information that's useful. How do we make a balance between those things, like needing to have people that share that content, but at the same time that content being something that people should be reading?
I understand. So how do we balance we call it clickbait, right? So how do we balance the things that will get people to click on particular articles versus the 20,000 word piece that we've done for our local newspaper and getting people to read that? I think it is a tough balance. That's hard. I think there are different apps and different ways to get things up to the public eye. And I think it's really smart to be aware of that. There's an app called Zeit, there's an app called Flipboard, there's other apps that are coming out that are actually tailoring pieces of news based on whatever you're into. So even though there's mixed feelings on that, that is one of the ways that people are getting their news now, and one of the ways that you can get in front of people's eyes. I think another thing, which someone told me at a journalism conference 2 weeks ago, which I absolutely loved, is that a tweet is the new headline. So what you put into a tweet, that's your headline. That's why the clickbait, if you talk about the former Upworthy, the controversial BuzzFeed, those guys, the reason why they're financially winning right now is because they know what it takes for people to click. And they know how to do it within a Snapchat. We can laugh about it, but we laughed about Facebook 5 years ago. So there is that element of understanding what the next step is going to be and compressing it into something that people will find digestible. And as one panelist said earlier, that's the onus is kind of on us to make those articles and those headlines interesting enough. It's not the fault of the audience that they're not reading our stuff. Just like it's not the fault of the reader if they don't buy one of my books. How is it their fault? Journalism's no different. So I think it's a matter of trying to capture these big ideas in something that's quick and digestible and using that as the entrance to get them to their bigger pieces. There's someone mentioned the long form podcast, which I would highly recommend, and it's essentially people talking to the people who write long form stories. And guess what? They exist. They're making a living. So people are writing these 10,000, 20,000 word pieces, and not just for the New Yorker and the Atlantic, but for a lot of independent publications too, some of them which pay well. So how do they get people to read them? They have a smart way of getting them in. So people want quality narratives. They want stories. If it's a good story, I don't care about length. Do you? So there's a whole long form and long reads movement that's happening right now. We should be hopping onto that But the only way we're going to be able to take advantage of that is actually having the door open enough so that people will understand what's going on inside. And that could be a very smart tweet. It could be a picture. It could be a quote. Those things that I talked about as far as the 6-second bind and the tweet from nowhere, what if those actually led to someplace? What if they weren't just a little video sitting there and that was the whole context? What if they actually led to a 10,000 word story about an uprising that was happening? People would probably read it. So,
When you talk about storytelling, the various types of storytelling that are out there, have you seen any kind of trends where people are consuming their news more from a video news rather than a text story published 1,000 word? Have you noticed any trends?
definitely. Number one, video is becoming king. It troubles me to say that, but it's the truth. So if you see the $1 billion purchase of Instagram, I know I'm talking numbers, but this part is important. The $1 billion purchase of Instagram a couple of years ago from Facebook. If you see the rise of Snapchat, which is essentially video and pictures, and that's worth, what, $20 billion now or something, I'm forgetting the number. The reason why they're so valuable is, number one, people are clicking on it, obviously. But number two, they're becoming the de facto way of storytelling. And so I would encourage people, all of us, even if we're wordsmiths, which is my origins, to understand these different things and understand how they work and play a part in them. I met the guy who's in charge of AJ Plus, which is Al Jazeera America's app that's dedicated to the news. And they launched an app, I'd say about 6 months ago. And it's like its own little Snapchat. You go on there, oh, there's a war going on. Well, watch a 6-second video. Oh, you want more? Oh, okay, well, why don't you read this 500-word piece? Oh, you want more than that? Okay, well, we have a 20-minute feature about it. Oh, you want more than that? Well, we have a 10,000-word feature that was written by one of our top war reporters. And so it's less about being in the narrow confines of particular things and more about saying, what are the many different ways I can reach my audience? And it could be as simple as taking your 10,000-word piece, putting it into a really smart tweet. The first app I worked on was called So Quotable, and it allowed you to capture people's quotes. And I know some of the quotes that I've captured in the app, they are stories in themselves. But imagine it, again, if those stories led to a book or to an article. So we're really talking about almost semantics. People still want stories. They just want them in different formats that fit whatever time they have. So the idea that storytellers aren't necessary, long stories aren't necessary, that's buckus, if that's the right word. Try not to curse here. But it's nonsense. And so it's more the ability to deliver it, particularly based on your audience. And I can get into a whole spiel about that. But understanding your audience enough to know how they want to deliver it to you. Any other questions? Oh, sure.
Are we in a tech bubble? Because we rode the .com in 1999 to 2001.
I'm only going to answer that if I'm getting paid. That's consulting. That's it. No, I think financially we might be in a tech bubble, but as far as technology transforming how we communicate with each other, yeah, that's only going forward. Yeah. Claire.
Well, can you give us an example of one of the scariest times that you moved from objective journalist to expert within the opinion? Like, did it scare you the first time, or what made you do it?
Books, actually. Yeah, I wish I had more. I love stories, and I don't have an amazing story with that. But it really was books. And I started, my first book was called Porn and Pong, How Grand Theft Auto, Tomb Raider, and Other Sexy Games Changed Our Culture. And so I started that based on an article I wrote for Playboy in 2001. I started researching it, and I wanted to do a longer piece on it. And they were like, nope, there's no connection between sexuality and technology. Get out of here. This is in 2001, so, you know, all is forgiven, right? So I kept looking into it, and I sent more queries, and it kept getting deeper, and no one wanted to follow it. So I said, well, I'll write a book. And that's how it happened. And the amazing thing with books is that, at least with the books that I wanted to write, I couldn't be a straight journalist anymore. I had to have an opinion. When I found a publisher for the book, he was like, this is all great, Damon, but there's this thing called Wikipedia that says everything that you just said. You're given this history about sexuality and technology. I can get that with Google or with Yahoo or whatever. You need to have a POV. And so I got a POV. And then I went back to work for these magazines and these newspapers with excerpts of the article. And then I thought they were on a train to Crazy Town. I'm like, of course there's a perspective on this. And they're like, well, no, we just want to know about what this video game means or what this technology means. We don't want any type of analysis. And I'm like, well, you can get that from a press release. And that started my transformation and eventually my crisis to what led to the talk today. Yeah.
What do you think of the term advocate journalist?
I think we're all advocate journalists. I think we advocate for certain communities, certain beats, certain ideas. I used to write about hip hop. I'm an advocate for hip hop. If I was advocating careful treatment of migrant workers, then would it be a different discussion? As much as me advocating for, I don't know, Jay-Z, right? So I think we all advocate for particular things. And I think that kind of circles back to what I was talking about, where we all have, there's a reason why we have the beats that we have. They're based on passions that we have. And if you have a particular passion, you're going to be an advocate for that community, for that idea, for that belief. And so I think the idea of advocacy journalism is great, but I think it's only applied when we're talking about famine in a particular country, or we're talking about global warming, or things that we immediately associate with a political stance, or a stance that's considered higher. But in reality, we're all doing advocacy journalism. That's my take on it. Any other thoughts? Yep.
How do you feel about the way that the media covers technology and new apps? And do you think that it's done well, or do you think it's missing something?
That could be a really long discussion. I think one of the things that happened, and I'll keep it brief for you non-technologists. I think one of the things that happened was that technology was considered a subset of a particular thing, or a cultural pillar. It's kind of over here. If you're talking about World of Warcraft, or if you're talking about the latest Mac, or if you're talking about a motorized car, then it belongs over here. The rest of the culture is over here. And in my 15 years of covering related industries and getting to know Apple and all these guys, that I'm realizing that we're all in a real tech bubble, not the financial one, but we're all within this tech world now. What I used to say is that I'd go to these tech conventions and they would have servers, if you guys know what those are. They'd have servers and they'd have hard drives and they'd have monitors. They'd have those kinds of things. That's what the tech conferences would have. And I'd say around 2005, 2006, when I started getting into my groove as a tech journalist, then suddenly they started having toothbrushes and refrigerators. And I have a son, so they started to have things for kids and all kinds of crazy stuff. And I'm like, wait, what's going on here? I thought technology was over here. So in reality, everything that we do is related to technology. So I don't think tech journalism really is quite a thing anymore. It's now just journalism. And that's very different from when I started 15 years ago.
Tech journalism, though, is expanding in unbelievable ways. New York Times just this week had the VR story. There's other things that before those things.
Right.
How do you think about virtual reality?
Yeah, I think with virtual reality, I think it is, I'd give it 5, 6, 7 years where it won't be us talking about, hopefully not talking about Baghdad, but it won't be us talking about Baghdad, but instead we'll be walking through with a stringer or an embedded reporter and looking at what he or she looks at. That's a whole different thing. And like here, like I can see it. But that's my job, right? But but I can see it right there, like it's right there. And we actually talked about this at a dinner last night with some of my AHA colleagues. Have you heard of Meerkat and Periscope? Have you? Raise your hand if you've heard about that. It's okay if you haven't. Wow, okay, gotcha. You guys that haven't, I can pull out my phone right now and use Meerkat or Periscope. They're both free apps for the iPhone, I think for the Android, and I can film you guys live. And it's very similar to Snapchat, where it's only live stuff. You can't really record stuff as much, but it's just live. So if someone wanted to see this conference live, see my keynote live, which I probably should have done, then I could have set it up with Periscope or Meerkat. How much further would it be to have me put on Google Glass or some type of crazy apparatus, and then the audience is able to see what I see? It's just taking that idea from a smartphone to something that can record it, and then the audience themselves putting the virtual reality glasses on. Again, Facebook just bought Oculus Rift, which is kind of the most popular VR headset, for I believe $3 billion about a year and a half ago. So when you get your Facebook feeds, say 5 years from now, don't be surprised if you're putting on goggles. So it really is the next level of things. And you know, I'm glad the New York Times is on top of it.
That's a good one to end on, I think, because we are up against